that occur once food enters the digestive tract. The first is mechanical digestion, in which food is broken down into smaller pieces. Next comes chemical digestion, in which chemicals are able to access these smaller pieces of food and break them down into their building blocks. Once the food is small enough, it is able to cross the plasma membrane of the intestines and the plasma membrane of the blood vessel and enter the blood. This is called absorption. This video is about chemical digestion. So chemical digestion is basically a process in which large food molecules are broken down into their building blocks. When chemicals are broken down into their building blocks, it's a process called catabolism. And of course you need enzymes to do this, which are produced by the digestive organs and glands. A very important chemical process that occurs in chemical digestion is called hydrolysis. And hydrolysis is when water, which is what hydro refers to, water, is added to a chemical and causes it to break apart. And that's what lysis means, to break apart. Each major food group uses different enzymes to break down the food into its building blocks so that it's small enough to pass the plasma membrane of the intestine. For example, simple sugars are the building blocks of carbohydrates. A simple sugar by itself is called a monosaccharide. Two monosaccharides joined are a disaccharide. And then many simple sugars are a polysaccharide. Polysaccharides form carbohydrates. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. When amino acids join, it's called a peptide. Many peptides form polypeptides, which eventually can form proteins. And lastly, fats are formed from fatty acids and alcohol. So you're going to see that each food group has very specific enzymes to break down the food. So let's start with the beginning of the digestive tract with ingestion. As food enters the mouth, the only chemical process that occurs is on complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates such as starch, which are found in potatoes or bread, are broken down to their building blocks, monosaccharides. And the enzyme that does this is called salivary amylase. After the food leaves the mouth, it passes through the pharynx and the esophagus, where there is no chemical digestion, and eventually enters the stomach. Now in the stomach, the only thing that's really broken down partially are proteins. And proteins aren't broken all the way down to amino acids, but they might be broken down to polypeptides. The enzyme that does this is called pepsin. Some other chemical reactions occurring in the stomach, which aren't really breaking down food, but I thought I would mention it here, is there's a chemical called renin, which is spelled R-E-N-N-I-N. And renin causes milk to coagulate. Renin is only found in infants, and as you know, infants' major diet is milk. It is not found in adults. Another chemical in the stomach, not involved in chemical breakdown, but still a chemical, is called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is produced in the stomach by cells called the parietal cells. And what it does is it allows the absorption of vitamin B12. So vitamin B12, if you remember from the other chapters, is needed to cause red blood cells to mature. So without intrinsic factor, it doesn't matter how much vitamin B12 is in your diet. You will not have the maturation of red blood cells, which will lead to anemia. Actually, the type of anemia it can lead to is called pernicious anemia. Sorry, there should be an RP. Pernicious anemia. And this happens more often in elderly people. Now remember, if red blood cells don't mature, they do grow, but they don't mature, and so you get these large pale cells called macrocytes, which aren't able to carry oxygen. So the problem is that it's not that there's not enough B12 in the diet. B12 can be found in meat, poultry, and meat, poultry, and fish, but it's that there's decreased amounts of intrinsic factor. And again, this happens in elderly people because as people age, the stomach mucosa atrophies, and so less intrinsic factor is produced. So what else is going on in the stomach? Because actually there are a lot of chemicals in the stomach. The stomach secretes about 3 liters of what's called gastric juice every day. And the pH of gastric juice is between 1.3 and 3.5. This is very acidic. This is so acidic that it would dissolve a bucket of nails in a week. So this gastric juice, again, contains lots of different chemicals. But the major one that you're going to find is hydrochloric acid, or HCl. And HCl is produced by parietal cells in the stomach. Now what the HCl does is breaks down the cell walls of plant food, and it also essentially starts to dissolve food. Another thing that we just discussed, another chemical released that's part of this gastric juice, is intrinsic factor. And remember, this is also produced by the parietal cells. Another chemical we mentioned is called pepsin. And pepsin is produced by the chief cells in the stomach. Remember that pepsin is going to begin to break down protein. Going to begin the process, but doesn't completely break down the protein. Another chemical found in the stomach is called histamine, and I'm sure you remember histamine from the immune chapter, which results in inflammation. But in this case, histamine causes the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid. Another chemical found in the stomach is serotonin, and these are all part of this gastric juice. Now you might remember serotonin as part of the nervous system. It's a chemical involved in mood. You also might remember it in the blood vessel chapter. It causes smooth muscle in blood vessels to contract, which causes the blood vessel to get smaller. In the stomach, it does pretty much the same thing. It causes contraction of the smooth muscle of the stomach. And this starts the stomach churning, which helps in the breakdown of food, the mechanical breakdown. Another chemical which is very important found in the stomach is called gastrin. And gastrin is actually a hormone, and it's produced by endocrine cells in the stomach called G cells. So these G cells, again, are in the stomach, even though they are endocrine tissue. And what this hormone does is it causes the parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid, and it causes the stomach muscles to contract. So gastrin essentially is increasing the breakdown of food, and is doing both chemically with hydrochloric acid and physically or mechanically. So all of these chemicals and more that I haven't mentioned make up what's called gastric juice, and you again produce about 3 liters of this per day. Very acidic. This acidity actually activates pepsinogen, which is a precursor to pepsin, and allows pepsin to then start to break down proteins. It also, the gastric juice mixture will denature proteins and kill bacteria. So if we think about it, if this is so acidic that it could dissolve a bucket of nails in a week, why doesn't it dissolve the lining of your stomach? Well, your stomach has three things that help protect it from this gastric juice. And the first, it is lined with a very thick coat of an alkaline mucus. Now remember, alkaline means it is basic. So the pH is greater than 7. And what this does is it neutralizes the acid lining the stomach. So again, it doesn't neutralize all the acid in the stomach, because then the gastric juice wouldn't be able to do its job. It neutralizes the acid lining the stomach. So not the whole thing. And that protects the stomach lining. Another thing that your stomach has is something called tight junctions. And you might remember from chapter on the heart, we talked about tight junctions, and in A&P 1-2, these are membrane junctions that hold adjacent cells together. They hold adjacent cells together and prevent them from separating. So this prevents the gastric juice from leaking through the stomach lining and into the tissue. And the last thing is that even with these protections, there is some damage to the lining of the stomach, which remember is epithelial tissue, simple columnar, but luckily epithelial tissue rapidly regenerates. That's what I meant to say. Rapidly regenerates, so that even if there is some damage, sorry, that's a mistake, regenerates, the tissue renews itself. In fact, the lining of your stomach renews itself every 3 to 6 days. Okay, so these three things together protect the lining of the stomach. Now, still, sometimes this isn't enough. And when the mucosal membrane is breached, you end up with inflammation. And if it's chronic, it can damage the underlying tissue. So what you end up with is an ulcer. If you look at the picture on the left side here, you can see an ulcer of the stomach, and there's lots of inflammation, and it looks like there's a little opening right there, a little hole, which can be quite painful. Believe it or not, 90% of all ulcers are not actually caused by a bacteria, which is called H. pylori. So in this photomicroscopy, you can see the bacteria here, the H. pylori, and colored in green. They're not really that color. And you can see the mucosa of the stomach. Remember, the lining is simple columnar epithelium. What the bacteria do is they release a toxin which destroys the epithelium. It disrupts the tight junctions. It also decreases HCl production and attracts immune cells so that inflammation occurs. An easy fix for this type of ulcer certainly would be antibiotics, and that's actually what physicians prescribe. So if we go back to chemical digestion occurring in the stomach, one of the major players is gastrin. So we're going to talk a little bit about gastrin. Remember, gastrin is a hormone that is released by the G cells in the stomach. And remember that gastrin causes the release of hydrochloric acid from the parietal cells and causes the smooth muscle to contract. So it's aiding in chemical digestion and mechanical. So when this is talking about regulation of gastric secretion, we're really talking about the release of gastrin. So what causes the release of gastrin? Well, there are both stimulatory and inhibitory events that occur. In other words, some things stimulate the release of gastrin and other things inhibit it. The things that stimulate or inhibit result in a reflex. So the release of gastrin is due to a reflex. And you might remember from A&P 1 that a reflex is a rapid, predictable, and involuntary response to a stimulus. In A&P 1, we talked a lot about reflexes that involved skeletal muscle. So things that trigger the contraction of skeletal muscles that you're not in control of. And the same thing happens every time, and it's very quick. And often you're aware of it. Well, there are also reflexes that involve the autonomic nervous system, which includes smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And these reflexes you're not always aware of. The release of gastrin is an autonomic reflex that you're often not aware of occurring. And the trigger for the reflex can occur in 3 places. So remember that reflexes have 5 major components. They have a receptor, a sensory neuron, they have the integration center, the motor neuron, and the effector. So the receptor is where the event that triggers the reflex occurs. And for the release of gastrin, there are 3 places that the trigger can occur. The first is called the cephalic phase, and this is when the trigger occurs in your head. Cephalic means towards the head. So prior to the food entering your stomach. So something that happens in your head can trigger the reflex of gastrin in your stomach. The second phase is called the gastric phase, and that is triggered once food enters your stomach. That causes a release of gastrin in your stomach. And the last phase is called the intestinal phase, and this is when the food is actually out of your stomach into your small intestine, and something occurs there that triggers the release of gastrin in your stomach. So let's look at these 3 phases. They might make more sense when we look at them individually. So the cephalic phase is triggers the release of gastrin when something happens in your head. And excitatory events, which can trigger the release of gastrin, include the sight of food. So seeing food can trigger the release of gastrin. Or even thinking about food, or tasting food, or smelling food. All of these things can cause a reflex to occur that ends up with the release of gastrin in your stomach. Because the stomach is getting ready for the food it thinks is coming by releasing acid, and the stomach muscles start contracting. On the other hand, if you are depressed, if you lose your appetite because of something you see or think about, or anything that decreases the stimulation of the parasympathetic division, resting and digesting, that can inhibit the release of gastrin even if you are eating food. Now what about once food gets to your stomach? Well, what can trigger the release of gastrin through a reflex? Well, when your stomach starts to fill up, it distends, which means it stretches, and this can activate stretch receptors, and that will trigger a release of gastrin in your stomach, causing the release of hydrochloric acid and smooth muscle contraction. Sometimes certain chemicals such as peptides or caffeine, or a rising pH, meaning a pH greater than 7, that can trigger a reflex that causes the release of gastrin. Now remember that this is a hormone, so gastrin is released by the parietal cell, by the G cells, into your blood, where it travels back to the stomach. Things that can inhibit the release of gastrin, a low pH, or if you're upset emotionally, because that triggers the sympathetic nervous system, which inhibits the parasympathetic, the resting and digesting. Now, what about once food leaves your stomach and enters the small intestine? Actually, there are things that can occur that trigger the release of gastrin in your stomach. This might seem strange because you might think, well, the food's already left the stomach. It's in the small intestine. So why would something happening there trigger the further release of gastrin in your stomach? Well, let's talk about this, because this intestinal phase begins as partially digested food begins to fill the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. And there are 2 phases, the excitatory and the inhibitory. These are 2 different reflexes. The excitatory phase is when gastrin The excitatory phase is when a reflex occurs that causes the release of gastrin in the stomach. Okay, so that's what the excitatory phase is. And this happens when partially digested food enters the duodenum. So remember that the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine where major amounts of chemical breakdown and absorption are going to occur. So at this point so far, not a lot of chemical breakdown has occurred. In the mouth, carbohydrates begin to be broken down. That's it. In the stomach, proteins begin to be broken down. That's it. But nothing has been broken down into small enough pieces such that they can be absorbed in the small intestine. Fats haven't even begun to be broken down. Either have proteins. So the duodenum has a lot of work to do. It's got to break down all the food groups to its building blocks, and then absorption has to occur. So it can only handle a little bit of chyme from the small intestine at a time. And if the chyme, which contains the partially digested food, is not broken down enough by the stomach, the intestine is going to release a hormone. And the hormone that it releases is called intestinal gastrin. Now, intestinal gastrin is going to then travel back to the stomach through the blood. Okay, it travels through the blood, and it's going to cause the stomach to release gastrin. And of course, the gastrin is going to cause more chemical and mechanical breakdown. So think about it this way again. The intestinal phase is when the small intestine is getting food from the stomach that has not been broken down enough for the small intestine to begin its process. So it releases a hormone called intestinal gastrin that travels to the stomach, that causes the stomach then to release gastrin, which causes more breakdown. So now when the food gets to the small intestine, it's in better shape. On the other hand, sometimes the small intestine, the duodenum, begins to distend or get stretched out. In other words, it's receiving too much food, or it's not processing it fast enough. And that can occur because it's getting a lot of fatty food, because fatty food takes longer to work on, or the chyme is very acidic. In this case, the intestine wants to say to the stomach, slow down your breakdown process. Slow it down because I'm backing up here. I'm slowing down in my process. You ate a lot of fatty foods from McDonald's, and I need more time to process the chyme you're sending. This is called the inhibitory phase because instead of saying to the stomach, speed up the chemical breakdown by releasing gastrin, it's saying slow down the chemical breakdown. And it does this through a process called the enterogastric reflux. So again, the purpose of this is to slow down the release of gastrin. Slow it down. And the purpose is to control the amount of chyme entering the small intestine. The small intestine is backed up. It needs to receive less chyme. Also, sometimes if the chyme is very acidic, this is a way to protect the small intestine from acidic chyme. Slow it down. So how does it work? Well, the first thing the small intestine does is release this group of hormones called enterogastrones. And these are produced in the small intestine. And what they inhibit is gastric secretion, but really what that means is they inhibit gastrin release in the stomach. The other thing that these hormones do is cause the pyloric sphincter to close. Now remember, this is the valve between the stomach and the small intestine. So now this is going to close so no more chyme can come through, and the enterogastrones are going to slow down the release of gastrin. So essentially this is slowing down the whole stomach in its production of chyme. There are many different enterogastrones. There are many different hormones that do this. I'll just list a few of them. We won't go into these, but you might see these later on. Secretin, somatostatin is another one. There's several of these, and if you read in the book, they'll mention them. Now this slide looks very busy, but it's essentially showing you all the things that we've mentioned about the release of gastric juice, and really what we mean here is by gastrin. So remember, we talked about things that can stimulate the release of gastrin. This is always via a reflex. It can occur, things that occur in your head, that's called the cephalic phase. Seeing, thinking, food, smelling, tasting, or events that occur in your stomach can stimulate the release of gastrin, such as when your stomach stretches, or when you get the chyme gets to the intestinal phase. There are things that can stimulate the secretive gastrin, such as partially digested food, because there's a lot of fatty food. Likewise, there are things that can inhibit the release. Okay, so that's the stomach. It seems like a lot's going on in the stomach in terms of chemical digestion, but actually the only thing that's really being broken down is proteins. So now we're going to travel to the small intestine, and you're going to find that most chemical breakdown is occurring here. So this is a major site in the gastrointestinal tract for chemical digestion, a major site. Now, what kind of chemicals are required? Well, there are hormones and there are enzymes, but a lot of these enzymes are coming from the pancreas. So in the duodenum, the pancreas is going to release pancreatic juice, which contains a tremendous amount of enzymes, digestive enzymes. In addition, there are some enzymes released from the microvilli of the small intestine walls. So what kind of chemical breakdown occurs in the small intestine? Well, remember that starch or complex carbohydrates began to be broken down in the mouth. They're completely broken down in the small intestine, and the enzyme that does this is called pancreatic amylase. So you can see this comes from the pancreas. Remember that protein began to be broken down in the stomach, but it is completely broken down in the small intestine, and some of the enzymes involved are trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. These come from the small intestine. These come from the pancreas. Fat hasn't even begun to be broken down. And so the pancreas releases an enzyme called lipase. Remember that enzymes often have the ASE at the end. So lipase is an enzyme that acts on lipids. And lastly, nucleic acids. The food that you eat has DNA in it and RNA. Chicken has chicken DNA. Plants have plant DNA, and they have to be broken down. And they are done that's done by nucleases, which are also released from the pancreas. How long does it take food to pass through the small intestine? Well, there's a lot going on here. Most chemical digestion and all absorption, for the most part, happens in the small intestine. But believe it or not, it only takes 3 to 6 hours for food to pass through the small intestine. Only 3 to 6 hours. Okay, so since the pancreas is a source of a lot of these enzymes, it's probably worth taking another look at the pancreas. And remember, we looked at the pancreas in the endocrine system. But let's look again. Remember, the pancreas is both an exocrine and an endocrine gland. Exocrine glands, remember, have ducts. The pancreas releases its pancreatic juices, or all of these digestive enzymes, through these ducts. And the cells that produce it are called the acinar cells. So all of these digestive enzymes that are entering the small intestine are produced by the acinar cells, which are exocrine tissue. Now remember that the pancreas also has endocrine tissue. It produces hormones, Remember, endocrine glands do not have ducts, and the endocrine glands that produce the hormones are called the islets of Langerhorn. There are two types of cells. Remember, the alpha cells secrete glucagon, and the beta cells secrete insulin. Now, just coming back to the digestive enzymes, the pancreas releases probably about 1,200 milliliters per day of these digestive enzymes. So there's quite a bit. And they are secreted in an inactive form in the small intestine. So when these are first secreted, they are inactive. And they are also alkaline. So this is an alkaline solution here of digestive enzymes. Once it hits the small intestine, which is very acidic, it becomes activated. So it's activated by the acidity of the small intestine. So let's take a look here at the pancreas and the duodenum and how I forgot about this. This is a short video on carbohydrates and how they affect your health. I'm going to let you watch this on your own, and we're going to move on to the pancreas, the picture. So you'll notice at the top here, you have the liver, the largest organ in the body. And the liver is where bile is made. That's one of the things in the liver. But here you'll notice the pancreas. Here's the pancreas. Here's the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine. Remember finding the pancreas in your digestive dissection. And the pancreas consists of the acinar cells, which are the exocrine tissue, and the islets of Langerhorn, which are the endocrine. But the acinar cells all dump into this main pancreatic duct. Remember, some of you were able to find this during the dissection. And the duct dumps into the duodenum. Now you'll also notice that there is bile produced in the liver. Bile is going to aid in the breakdown of fat. We'll talk about that in a minute. But bile is made in all lobes of the all lobes of the liver. On the right side of the liver, the bile is going to enter the right hepatic duct, and from the left side, the left hepatic duct. The right and the left hepatic duct combine to form the common hepatic duct. These are things, you had to find this on your dissection. And the common hepatic duct flows into the bile duct. So the bile, which is shown in green here, is going to travel down until it meets a sphincter, which when it's closed, prevents the bile from entering the duodenum. Then the bile will back up into the cystic duct and start to fill up the gallbladder. So remember, the gallbladder is mainly a holding tank. Now you'll notice that the bile duct and the pancreatic duct fuse, and where they fuse, there's a bump called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And this is where both bile and pancreatic enzymes enter the duodenum. Let's look a little closer here. And now we're going to talk more about the gallbladder. So the liver creates bile. And on the next slide, we mention a little bit about bile. It's a yellow-greenish color, so it really is this color. It is very alkaline, and it contains salts that are made of cholesterol. Okay, again, this is on the next slide. The cholesterol and the salts help to emulsify fat. I'm going to mention that in a minute. So bile helps in the breakdown of fat. So again, bile is produced in the liver. It travels through the duct, through the right and left hepatic duct, into the common hepatic duct, and then into the bile duct, where it backs up if the sphincter is closed and enters the gallbladder. Now certain enzymes, these aren't enzymes, certain hormones cause the release of the bile. So when you eat certain types of food that have fat in it, the bile is released into the small intestine, the duodenum. And here you can see a lipid, which is fat. Now in this case, the fat is fairly large, which makes it hard for the lipase to attack. So the lipase can't really attack lipids, when it's in its large form, it has to be broken into smaller molecules. And that's what bile does. It breaks lipid into smaller molecules so that the surface area is larger, and it is easier now for the enzyme lipase to break it down. That's what emulsification is. It's taking a large molecule and breaking it into smaller molecules. Okay, this is just a quick summary of what I mentioned in the last slide, what bile is made of. A bilirubin is something that's also in bile. This is a breakdown product of red blood cells and heme. This is just another slide showing you how bile works. Here's the large fat globule. The bile salts break it down into smaller droplets that then the lipase is able to break down further. Once it's broken down further, it's able to pass through the intestinal wall, and it's taken up by the lymph glands or the lymph nodes. Okay, so the major chemical processes occur in the small intestine, and that's where most absorption occurs. So now we're into the large intestine. Well, what kind of chemical breakdown is going to occur there? Well, very little, because most of the chemical breakdown occurred in the small intestine, and most things of value were absorbed there. Pretty much what's in the large intestine is waste. However, there is something going on in the large intestine. There are bacteria here that are going to digest, that's probably the best way to describe it, the remaining material. And some of these bacteria produce two important vitamins, and these are called vitamin K and vitamin B. I should say the B vitamins. So these include, there's a lot of B vitamins, B1, B2, B6, B12, there's a whole bunch of them. So these bacteria live in our large intestine. We give them a place to live, and we give them food, and they give us vitamin K and vitamin B. Now, you might remember that vitamin K is needed for clotting. And the B vitamins are needed for maturation of red blood cells. So I'm just going to write red blood cells. So this unique experience where bacteria live with us, so two organisms living together in which they both benefit, is called symbiosis. So here's an example of symbiosis. Just to mention, there are more than 400 species of bacteria that have been identified in feces of a single person. Some of these bacteria are harmful, but a lot of them have a variety of roles that we haven't even identified. So some of them have been identified, a lot of them have not. These bacteria constitute what's called the microbiome. And there is more and more research showing that these bacteria can affect a tremendous amount of properties in humans. So I urge you to go online, find reputable resources, and read about the microbiome in humans and how it affects us. It's fascinating. And that is the end of chemical processes occurring in the digestive tract.